Why do historians draw comparisons among Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great?
All four men were fiercely powerful and seemingly indomitable leaders. And their early lives and careers shared some interesting characteristics as well. First, none of them were native sons of the countries they ended up ruling, and some would say, defining. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, was born in Georgia. German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, in Austria. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in Corsica, which, though technically a new possession of France, was decidedly more Italian in nature. And King of the Macedonians Alexander the Great, 356–323 BC, was from the fringe city-state of Macedonia. Yet it was, respectively, Russian, German, French, and Greek culture that each leader spread. All four men rose to power through the military, or, in Alexander's case, who succeeded his father, after having carried out military strategy. Once installed as rulers, all led fantastic military campaigns to expand their spheres of influence. The wars brought on by their nationalism left millions dead. Finally, all four men inspired, and some would say continue to inspire, terror in the human soul. Still, history has been more forgiving of both Alexander and Napoleon, who today seem to be portrayed as often as heroes as they are as megalomaniacs. With Hitler's and Stalin's horrible legacies a more recent memory. The view of these men is decidedly and far more consistently dark and loathsome.
Which countries comprised the Allies in World War II?
The three major Allied powers were Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union. Their leaders, Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, Franklin Roosevelt, 1880–1945, and Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, were referred to as the Big Three. They and their military advisors developed the strategy to defeat the Axis countries, though Stalin, for the most part, acted alone on the Soviet front. China, which had been at war with Asian rival Japan since 1937, also joined the Allies. 46 other countries became part of the Allied front before the war was over. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. And within days Great Britain entered into fighting against Germany. Australia, New Zealand, India, France, South Africa, and Canada also allied with Great Britain, as did Norway. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in 1940, all of them under siege by Nazi Germany. Greece entered the war later that year, as did Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union entered the war. And in the days after the Japanese bombing of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, On December 7, 1941, 12 more Allied countries became involved in the war, chief among them, the United States and China. The others, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, were all Caribbean and Latin American countries. Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Cuba, and Guatemala. The year 1942 saw 3 more countries join the Allies: Mexico in May, Brazil in August, and Ethiopia in December. In 1943 and 1944, in what were perhaps the darkest days of the war, Iraq, Bolivia, Iran, and Colombia signed on as Allied nations, followed by the tiny country of San Marino. Significant since it is situated wholly within the boundaries of Axis power Italy, Colombia, and Liberia. February and March of 1945 saw another wave of nations siding with the Allies. The South American countries of Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Chile, Venezuela, Uruguay, and Argentina, along with the Middle Eastern countries of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. Mongolia, the Mongolian People's Republic, in Central Asia, was the last to join the Allies. On August 9, 1945. Of course, the level of support each Allied nation lent to the war effort varied. But it was significant that the list of Allied nations grew longer with each year that the war was fought.
When did rail service in the United States reach from coast to coast?
On May 10, 1869, the last tracks of the United States' first cross-country railroad were laid, making North America the first continent to be spanned from coast to coast by a rail line. The event was the fulfillment of a great national dream to knit the vast country closer together. Short-run rail lines had been in use since the 1840s, but the nation lacked a method for transporting people, raw materials, and finished goods between distant regions. In the early 1860s, U.S. Congress decided in favor of extending the railroad across the country. The federal government granted land and extended millions of dollars in loans to 2 companies to complete the project. After a long debate that had become increasingly sectional, the legislature had earlier determined the railroad should run roughly along the 42nd parallel from Omaha, Nebraska, to Sacramento, California. This route was settled on for its physical properties. The topography of the landscape would best allow the ambitious project. The Union Pacific Railroad was to begin work in Omaha and lay tracks westward. The Central Pacific Railroad was to begin in Sacramento and lay tracks eastward, crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains. Work began in 1863, and 6 years later the 2 projects met at Promontory in north-central Utah, northwest of Ogden. The Central Pacific Railroad laid 689 miles of track eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific Railroad laid 1,086 miles of track westward from Omaha. 600 workers, including numerous Irish, Chinese, and Mexican immigrant workers, attended the May 10, 1869, ceremony celebrating the accomplishment. The last steel spike that was driven into the railroad was wired to a telegraph line. When the spike was pounded, a signal was sent around the world to announce the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. By the end of the 1800s, 15 rail lines crossed the nation.
Is the bombing of buildings a new phenomenon?
Though terrorist bombings seem a plague of recent decades, the history of such strikes goes back to a time before the word terrorism was part of everyday language. In 1920, a bomb explosion on September 16 ripped through the J.P. Morgan Bank building in New York City, killing 39 people, 30 of them instantly, injuring 300 more, and causing $2 million in property damage. According to eyewitness accounts, the bomb had been carried by a horse-drawn carriage into the heart of America's financial center just before midday, and it exploded as nearby church bells tolled noon. Among the victims were passers-by in the street and people working at their desks, including some high-ranking personnel at J.P. Morgan. Suspicion centered around anarchists, some of whom were questioned by the police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. But no culprit was ever found. Until September 11, 2001, that event was the deadliest bombing in New York City history. Further, the many bombings carried out by white supremacists during the civil rights movement in the 1960s are also testimony to the fact that targeted bombings are not a new phenomenon. Between 1962 and 1965, as the Council of Federated Organizations worked to register voters in Mississippi, racial extremists turned to violence. Among the tactics used in addition to shootings, beatings, and lynches were bombings. During Freedom Summer, 1964, alone, more than 65 homes, churches, and other buildings were bombed in Mississippi. Perhaps the most widely publicized of those bombings was the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, on September 15. 1963, 200 people were attending Sunday services when a bomb exploded. 4 young African American girls were killed. But the sorrow of that day did not stop there. The bombing provoked racial riots, and police used dogs to control the crowds. 2 black schoolboys were killed in the melee.
Were any countries besides Switzerland neutral during World War II?
Yes, in its official stance of neutrality, Switzerland was joined by Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, and Argentina. However, post-war findings indicated the neutrality of these countries, with the exception of Argentina, was not an absolute policy. Some have described these countries as only nominally neutral. A 1998 report released by U.S. Under-Secretary of State Stuart Eizenstat indicated that the Swiss had converted Nazi gold to Swiss francs. and that Germany had used that exchange to buy minerals from Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Turkey. The report further pointed out that Sweden had allowed 250,000 Nazi troops to cross its country in order to reach neighboring Finland, where the Germans fought Soviet forces. Eisenstadt, who headed a U.S. government effort to determine where Nazi gold ended up, was assisted in his research by State Department historians. Although the investigation's reports were critical of these neutral countries, Eisenstadt also pointed out that all the countries were in difficult positions during the conflict. For example, Switzerland was completely surrounded by German-occupied countries. Nevertheless, Jewish groups brought lawsuits against the Swiss government and 3 Swiss banks for their role in converting looted Nazi gold into currency during World War II.
What are VE Day and VJ Day?
VE Day stands for Victory in Europe Day, and VJ Day stands for Victory over Japan Day. After the German surrender was signed in Reims, France, the headquarters of General Dwight D. Eisenhower 1890–1969, in the wee hours of May 7, 1945, U.S. President Harry S. Truman. 1884–1972, declared May 8 VE Day the end of the World War II fighting in Europe. But it was not until the Japanese agreed to surrender on August 14, 1945, that World War II ended. September 2, 1945, was declared the official VJ Day since it was then that Japan signed the terms of surrender on the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay.
What was the anti-apartheid movement?
It was an international movement to throw out the decades-old system of racial segregation in South Africa. The word apartheid means separateness in the South African language of Afrikaans. Under apartheid, which was formalized in 1948 by the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, minority whites were given supremacy over non-whites. The system further separated non-white groups from each other so that mulattoes, those of mixed race, Asians, mostly Indians, and Native Africans were segregated. The policy was so rigid that it even separated native Bantu groups from each other. Blacks were not allowed to vote, even though they were and are the majority population. Apartheid was destructive to the society as a whole and drew protest at home and abroad. But the South African government adhered to the system, claiming it was the only way to keep peace among the country's various ethnic groups. In 1961 the government even went so far as to withdraw from the British Commonwealth in a dispute over the issue. Protesters against apartheid staged demonstrations and strikes, which sometimes became violent. South Africa grew increasingly isolated as countries opposing the system refused to trade with the apartheid government. The no-trade policy had been urged by South African civil rights leader and former Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, 1931. Who led a nonviolent campaign to end apartheid and in 1984 won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. During the 1980s, the economic boycott put pressure on the white minority South African government to repeal apartheid laws. It finally did so, and in 1991 the system of segregation was officially abolished. White South African leader F.W. de Klerk, 1936, who was elected in 1989, had been instrumental in ending the apartheid system. In April 1994, South Africa held the first elections in which blacks were eligible to vote. Not surprisingly, black South Africans won control of parliament, which in turn elected black leader Nelson Mandela, 1918, as president. De Klerk was retained as deputy president. The two men won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their efforts to end apartheid and give all of South Africa's peoples full participation in government. In 1996, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a panel headed by Desmond Tutu and charged with investigating the political crimes committed under apartheid, began work. Its investigations continued in 1999, with many findings proving controversial.
What was the most damaging earthquake in recent history?
It was a July 28, 1976, quake that rocked the Chinese city of Tangshan at 4 o'clock in the morning. In less than a minute, 89% of the homes and 78% of the industrial buildings were destroyed, killing 250,000 people, according to the official reports. However, international observers believe the death toll was even higher, about 750,000. Which means that the quake claimed 3/4 of the area's total population. A quake had not occurred in that region in 6 centuries. And the area was considered to be at low risk for earthquakes. Consequently, the building codes in the region were not stringent enough for the structures to withstand the force of the quake.
When did Martin Luther King Jr. give his "I Have a Dream" speech?
The occasion was the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. That summer day, more than a quarter million people lobbying for congressional passage of a civil rights bill gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to hear speakers, including the charismatic and influential King, 1929 to 1968. His eloquent words define the movement and still inspire those who continue to work for reforms. Among his words were these: "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act, in 1964. The most comprehensive American civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction, the 12-year period that followed the Civil War. The act outlawed racial discrimination in public places, assured equal voting standards for all citizens, prohibited employer and union racial discrimination, and called for equality in education.
What is Bessemer steel?
Developed during the early 1850s. The Bessemer process was the first method for making steel cheaply and in large quantities. Named for its inventor, British engineer Henry Bessemer, 1813 to 1898. The process was also developed independently by William Kelly, who patented the process in 1857, in the United States. Bessemer and Kelly experimented with injecting, blowing, air into molten pig iron, crude iron. The oxygen in the air helps rid the iron of its impurities, such as manganese, silicon, and carbon, converting the iron to molten steel, which is then poured into molds. The process was introduced in the U.S. steel manufacturing industry in 1864. Alloys were also added to the refining process to help purify the metal. Within 2 decades, the method was used to produce more than 90% of the nation's steel. It was also implemented throughout the industrialized world. In the mid-1800s, rich iron ore deposits had been discovered in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, along Lake Superior. The discovery of the minerals and the innovation of the Bessemer process combined to create a thriving steel industry in the United States. At the same time, there was a growing market for the material. Railroads needed iron to make rail gauges, while the new auto manufacturing industry used steel to make cars. As a result, between 1880 and 1910, annual U.S. steel production increased by a factor of 20. One of the early industry leaders was Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. Who in 1873 founded the nation's first large-scale steel plant, at Braddock, Pennsylvania. In 1901, Carnegie sold this and other steel mills to the United States Steel Corporation. Today the USX Corporation, which is the largest steel producer in the United States. The Bessemer process continued to be used until after World War II, 1939 to 45. The open hearth method of purification gradually replaced it.
When did department stores begin?
Department stores, which offer a wide variety of goods for sale in various departments, emerged in the mid-1800s. Many evolved out of general stores, which offered a variety of goods but not divided into departments, while others evolved out of dry goods stores, which sold textiles and related merchandise. The first bona fide department store was established in Paris, the Bon Marché, French meaning good bargain. Opened its doors in 1838. Between the 1850s and 1880s. Numerous department stores opened in American cities including Jordan Marsh, founded 1851 in Boston, Massachusetts. R. H. Macy's, founded 1858 in New York City, the store was known for its creative advertisements. Wanamaker's, founded 1861 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It successfully implemented fixed pricing so that customers no longer haggled over price, and Marshall Field, founded 1881 in Chicago. Within 25 years it became the world's largest wholesale and retail dry goods store. These pioneer department stores, multi-storied enterprises located in downtown areas, introduced many innovations to merchandising, including the policy of returnable or exchangeable goods. Ready-made apparel, clearly marked prices, and window displays. By the early 1900s, department stores could be found throughout the country. The timing was right for their emergence. Urban centers grew rapidly at the end of the century, giving department stores a ready clientele. The advent of the telephone, electric lighting, and billing machines helped retailers conduct business efficiently. Transportation improvements allowed for the shipment of large quantities of goods, and a variety of finished goods were mass-produced, increasing supply and lowering cost of production as well as the price to the consumer. By the 1910s the stores were part of a new mass culture, which centered in American cities. During the 20th century, department store sales typically ranged between 6 and 12% of total annual retail sales.
How old are card games?
Card games are believed to have originated in China in about A.D. 800. By the late 1200s cards had made their way to Italy, perhaps carried aboard merchant ships, and from there spread to other parts of Europe. The present-day variety of four suits, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades was adopted in France during the 1500s.
Is blues music older than jazz?
Only slightly, and only if your definition of jazz doesn't include ragtime. Really, the two musical traditions developed side by side, with blues emerging about the first decade of the 1900s and hitting the height of its early popularity in 1920s Harlem, where the songs were seen as an expression of African American life. Great blues singers like Ma Rainey, 1886 to 1939, and Bessie Smith, 1894 or 1898 to 1937, sang of the black reality determined but weary. During the Harlem Renaissance the music was a symbol for African American people who were struggling to be accepted for who they were. Poet Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967, saw the blues as a distinctly black musical genre, and as helping to free blacks from American standardization. as the first person to codify and publish blues songs. American musician and composer W. C. Handy, 1873 to 1958, is considered the father of the blues. The Florence, Alabama, native produced a number of well-known works, including Memphis Blues, St. Louis Blues, which is one of the most frequently recorded songs in popular music, Beale Street Blues, and Careless Love.
Is there a golden age of television?
Yes, people commonly refer to the 1950s as TV's golden age, which is the decade when Americans embraced television and the networks responded with the rapid expansion of programming. Critics still hail the programs of the golden age to be the most innovative programming in television history. It was during this decade that anthology programs such as Kraft Television Theater, Playhouse 90, and Studio One made live drama part of the nightly fare on primetime television. Americans could tune in to watch original screenplays such as 12 Angry Men, 1954, Visit to a Small Planet, 1955, and The Miracle Worker, 1957. And tune in they did, prompting the production of more than 30 anthology programs sponsored by the likes of Goodyear, Philco, U.S. Steel, Breck, and Schlitz, since the production work was based in New York. The anthologies drew young playwrights including Gore Vidal, Rod Serling, Arthur Miller, and A. E. Hotchner. A new group of prominent television directors and producers emerged, and the studio dramas attracted the talents of actors George C. Scott, James Dean, Paul Newman, Grace Kelly, Eva Marie Saint, Sidney Poitier, Lee Remick, and Jack Lemmon. The other cornerstone of 1950 television programming was the variety show also done live. Comedians Jack Benny, Red Skelton, Jackie Gleason, George Burns, Sid Caesar, and Mr. Television Milton Berle thrived in the format. But the cost of producing live programs and the growing popularity of television, which created a new mass market that demanded even more programming, combined to spell the end of television's golden age. Soon, live dramas and variety shows were replaced by situation comedies, westerns, and other set-staged programs that could be taped in advance, and could be produced in quantity.
What was the Peace of Westphalia?
In 1644, with Europe torn by the 30 Years' War, 1618–48. A peace conference was convened in Westphalia, Germany. But the negotiations were for long years in the making. The fighting continued until 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia was finally signed. Under this treaty, France and Sweden received some German lands. The agreement also made important allowances for Europe's religions. Not only was Lutheranism given the same due as Catholicism, but Calvinism. The religious movement begun by Frenchman John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, was given the official nod. In short, the treaty not only ended the religious warfare in Europe, but it provided for some measure of religious tolerance. Since the pact recognized the sovereignty of all the states of the Holy Roman Empire, it effectively dissolved the empire. Therefore, historians view the Peace of Westphalia as the beginning of Europe's modern state system.
Who invented jazz?
Ferdinand Jelly-Roll Morton, 1885 to 1941, a New Orleans pianist, claimed credit for having invented jazz. And to some degree, it was fair of him to think so after all, his recordings with the group the Red Hot Peppers, 1926 to 30, are among the earliest examples of disciplined jazz ensemble work. But in truth, the evolution of jazz from ragtime and blues was something that many musicians in several cities took part in. Most regard Morton as one of the founders of jazz. The other founders include Benny Moten, 1894 to 1935, U.B. Blake, 1883 to 1983, Duke Ellington, 1899 to 1974, and Thomas Fats Waller, 1904 to 1943. Some would go back even farther to trace the roots of jazz, from 1899 to 1914 Scott Joplin, 1868 to 1917, popularized ragtime, which was based on African folk music. Even astute music critics may not be able to draw a clear-cut distinction between ragtime and early jazz. Both musical forms rely on syncopation, the stressing of the weak beats. And either style can be applied to an existing melody and transform it. The definitions and boundaries of the two terms have always been subject to debate, which is further complicated by the fact that some musicians of the time considered ragtime to be more or less a synonym for early jazz. But there are important, albeit not strict, differences between the two genres as well. Rags were composed and written down in the European style of notation, while early jazz was learned by ear. Players would simply show one another how a song went by playing it. Jazz encourages and expects improvisation, whereas ragtime, for the most part, did not. And the basic rhythms are also markedly different, with jazz having a swing or hot rhythm that ragtime does not. Whatever its origins, jazz became part of the musical mainstream by the 1930s and influenced other musical genres as well, including classical. American composer George Gershwin, 1898-1937, was both a songwriter and composer of rags as well as a composer of symphonic works. Many of his works, including Rhapsody in Blue, 1924, and his piano preludes, contain ragtime and jazz elements. Perhaps more than any other composer and musician, Miles Davis, 1926 to 1991, expanded the genre, through decades of prolific work. Davis constantly pushed the boundaries of what defines jazz and in so doing set standards for other musicians.
Why is the Magna Carta important?
The Magna Carta, arguably the most famous document in British history, has had many interpreters since it was signed by King John, 1167 to 1216, who was under pressure to do so. On June 15, 1215, in the meadow which is called Runnymede, between Windsor and Staines, in Surrey, England. Drawn up by English barons who were angered by the king's encroachment on their rights. The charter has been credited with no less than ensuring personal liberty and putting forth the rights of the individual, which include the guarantee of a trial by jury. No freeman shall be arrested and imprisoned, or dispossessed, or outlawed, or banished, or in any way molested, nor will be set forth against him, nor sent against him, unless by the lawful judgment of his peers, and by the law of the land. King John, who ruled from 1199 to 1216 and was also called John Lackland, had a long history of abuse of power, while his brother Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1199, was still king. John tried to wrest the throne from him. Though he failed in his effort, when Richard died in 1199, John did ascend to king, inheriting 4 French duchies, which he soon lost. Upon his refusal to recognize the new Archbishop of Canterbury, John was excommunicated. In order to regain favor with the Pope, he was forced to give up his kingdom, 1213, and receive it back as a papal fief. He was further required to pay an annual tribute to the Pope. It was in raising funds that John ran into trouble with England's powerful barons, who were outraged at and tired of his interference in their affairs. The barons drafted the 63 chapters of the Magna Carta, writing it in the king's voice, and met John along the banks of the Thames River as he returned in 1215 from an unsuccessful invasion of France. The document, to which John was forced to put his seal, asserted the rights of the barons, churchmen, and townspeople, and provided for the king's assurance that he would not encroach on their privileges. In short, the Magna Carta stipulated that the king, too, was subject to the laws of the land. In that the Magna Carta made a provision for a great council, to be comprised of nobles and clergy who would approve the actions of the king vis-a-vis his subjects and ensure the tenets set forth in the charter were upheld. It is credited with laying the foundation for a parliamentary government in England. After signing it, John immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III. 1160 or 1161 to 1216, who issued an annulment of the charter. Nevertheless, John died before he could fight it, and the Magna Carta was later upheld as the basis of English feudal justice. It is still considered by many to be the cornerstone of constitutional government.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
Who invented the television?
The television, which may seem to many to be a decidedly American invention, was actually the outcome of a series of inventions by a cast of international characters. As early as 1872, British engineer Willoughby Smith, 1828 to 1891. Inspired by an experiment on selenium rods, imagined a system of visual telegraphy. 5 years later, the tube technology that would make television possible was developed in Strasbourg by German physicist Carl Ferdinand Braun, 1850 to 1918. He invented a cathode ray tube, also known as the Braun tube, which improved the Marconi wireless, radio, technology by increasing the energy of sending stations, and arranged antennas to control the direction of radiation. In 1907, Russian physicist Boris Rosing proposed using Braun's tube to receive images, something he called electric vision. 1 year later, Alan Campbell Swinton, 1863 to 1930, suggested using the cathode ray tube to both receive and transmit images. That same year, the idea of using cathode ray tubes to scan images for the purpose of television was published, and by 1912 it was being worked on by Rosing and his former pupil, Vladimir Zworykin, 1889 to 1982, in Russia. In 1923, a competing technology, which was entirely mechanical, reached an early milestone when British inventor John Logie Baird, 1888 to 1946, demonstrated an electrified hatbox with discs, which constituted the world's first working television set. But the race was still on, and in that same year, Zworykin, who had moved to the United States in 1919 and was hired by Westinghouse Electronic Corporation, in 1920, advanced the tube-based technology when he patented the iconoscope, which would become the television camera. In 1929, Zworykin, now a U.S. citizen, invented the kinescope, television tube. Zworykin's inventions together comprised the first electronic television. Regularly scheduled U.S. television began on April 30, 1939, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, opened the New York World's Fair, billed as the World of Tomorrow, giving a speech that was the first televised presidential talk. The national broadcasting company's, NBC, coverage of the fair's opening initiated its weekly television scheduling. A victory for parent company RCA, whose president, David Sarnoff, 1891 to 1971, founded NBC and is considered a broadcasting pioneer.
Why was John Paul II called the People's Pope?
Because during his 27-year tenure, he dramatically changed the public perception of the Pope. Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, 1920–2005, was named Pope John Paul II on October 16, 1978. Becoming the first non-Italian head of the Roman Catholic Church in 455 years. From the first moments of his service, it was clear that this was a different kind of pope. Upon his election, he greeted the cardinals of the conclave his brothers standing rather than seated, which was the tradition. A few weeks after his election, he leaned out the windows of the Vatican Palace to sing carols with 50,000 children gathered in St. Peter's Square to celebrate Christmas. Instead of limiting his concerns to the administration of the church, he traveled far and wide to carry the message of Christianity to the people. Crowds, often numbering in the hundreds of thousands to millions, gathered to see him around the globe. In 1979 he made his first trip to the United States. After which Time magazine ran a cover story with the headline, "John Paul, Superstar." Pope John Paul fought for freedom of religion everywhere, even challenging his communist homeland. His call for solidarity contributed to the downfall of communism in Poland and across the Eastern Bloc. He published regularly memoirs as well as books of prayers, lessons, meditations, and poetry. Despite his active ministry on the world stage, he remained a traditionalist, never wavering from the ages-old teachings of the Catholic Church. When he died on April 2, 2005, he was hailed both as a holy man and a man of peace by Christians and non-Christians alike.
When were the first schools established?
The first formal education began shortly after the development of writing, c. 3000 BC, when both the Sumerians, who had developed a cuneiform system of pictographics, and the Egyptians, who developed hieroglyphics, established schools to teach students to read and write the systems. After the development of the first alphabet, between 1800 and 1000 BC, by Semitic people in Syria, religious schools were set up. Priests taught privileged boys to read sacred Hebrew writings, the Torah. The first school that was open to everyone, not just the upper classes, may well have been that established by Chinese philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, who taught literature and music, conduct, and ethics to anyone who wanted to learn. The Western model of education is based on the ancient Greek schools, which were founded about the 5th century BC, in the city-state of Sparta. Boys were not only trained for the military, they also learned reading and writing and studied music. In Athens, boys learned to read and write, memorized poetry, and learned music as well as trained in athletics. In the second half of the 5th century BC, the Sophists, Ancient Greek teachers of rhetoric and philosophy schooled young men in the social and political arts, hoping to mold them into ideal statesmen.
What were the Dark Ages of ancient Greece?
After the Dorians conquered the Mycenaeans in 1100 B.C., these nomadic peoples thrust Greece into a period of decline that lasted more than 300 years. The Dorians rejected the life of the great Mycenaean cities in favor of their nomadic shepherding and hunting life. A tribal people, they possessed a harsh sense of justice, and the period was marked by feuds between clans. Men typically carried weapons now made of iron. It was the Dorians who brought the new, more durable metal from the north, ending the Bronze Age in Greece. During this Dark Age, there is little evidence of Greek civilization. The script used by the Mycenaeans disappeared, and art, which had prospered during the Mycenaean Age, declined. Under Dorian rule, numerous Mycenaean cities were abandoned, and many regions and islands seem to have been depopulated. There is no evidence of trade with other countries. Poverty had overtaken the Greeks. As the Dorians took possession of the Greek mainland, a few Mycenaean communities survived in remote areas. Many Mycenaeans fled eastward to Athens, which became a haven for those who hoped for a return to the former civilization. Other Mycenaeans crossed the Aegean and settled on the coast of Asia Minor. Most of these refugees spoke Ionian Greek. A lasting legacy of the Dark Ages of Greece is its mythology. As Ionian Greeks attempted to hold on to the refined civilization of the Bronze Age, they commemorated the greatness of the past in song and verse, including Greek poet Homer's, c. 850-BC. Iliad and Odyssey. These epics were combined with 8th-century poet Hesiod's Theogony, an account of the creation of the universe and the generations of the gods, to give rise to a new Greek religion based on the god Zeus and 11 other gods who were believed to reside on Mount Olympus in northeastern Greece. The Greek gods were later adopted by the Romans and given different names.
What were the fireside chats?
They were radio broadcasts of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's, 1882 to 1945, messages to the American people. FDR began making the informal addresses on March 12, 1933. During the long and dark days of the Great Depression. In his efforts to reassure the nation, FDR urged listeners to have faith in the banks and to support his New Deal measures. Sometimes beginning his talks with my friends, the radio broadcasts were enormously successful and attracted more listeners than even the most popular broadcasts during this golden age of radio. FDR continued his fireside chats into the 1940s, as Americans turned their attention to the war effort.
How many immigrants arrived at Ellis Island?
More than 12 million people first entered the United States through Ellis Island. Their descendants account for an estimated 40% of the nation's current population. The majority of new arrivals were European, but immigrants also came from the West Indies, Asia, and the Middle East. More men than women arrived at the immigration depot. Originally a 3-acre landmass, the island is situated in the New York harbor, off the southern tip of Manhattan. It was named for Samuel Ellis, a merchant and farmer who owned the island during the late 1700s. New York acquired the land, and in 1808 sold it to the federal government. The site served as a fort, and later, an arsenal. By the end of the century, record numbers of immigrants prompted the federal government to establish a bureau to process the new arrivals, the vast majority of whom entered the country at its largest port, New York City. On January 1, 1892, the Federal Immigration Station opened on the island in the shadows of the Statue of Liberty, dedicated 1886, on nearby Bedloe Island. The Ellis Island facility, which by 1901 consisted of 35 buildings, was the country's chief immigration station. Its heaviest use was in processing the influx of immigrants who arrived between 1892 and 1924. The facility was closed on November 29, 1954, when immigration quotas had drastically reduced the number of incoming people and the mass processing center was no longer needed. On May 11, 1965, Ellis Island was designated a National Historic Site. During the 1980s it was extensively restored so that visitors to the park and museum are afforded a glimpse of what their ancestors experienced upon arriving in this new land.
What is king cotton?
King cotton was an expression of the mid-1800s, when cotton had become so vital to the economies of southern states that it was said to rule them. Until the 1790s, growers were limited to producing the quantity of cotton that could be processed by slaves. Separating cotton's fibers from its seeds was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. The bolls were dried in front of a fire, and the seeds were picked out by hand. In 1793, American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, introduced the cotton gin. In one day, his machine could clean 50 times as much cotton fiber than could a manual laborer. While Whitney patented the machine in 1794, imitations were nevertheless quickly put into production by shrewd businessmen who observed the effect the gin could have on the nation's cotton industry. There was no shortage of demand for the fiber. Just before Whitney developed the gin, another inventor, British-born Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton, which he introduced at a Rhode Island mill in 1790. As the 1800s dawned, Machinery had made cotton the center of the nation's emerging textiles industry. Growers in the South stepped up cotton production to keep up with factories' demands. Slave labor and excellent growing conditions in the southern states, predominantly Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, combined to dramatically increase production. By 1849, cotton exports reached $66 million a year and accounted for roughly 2/5 of total U.S. exports. But cotton came at a dear price. While laborers in the North's textile factories worked under difficult and sometimes dangerous circumstances, in the South cotton crops were planted and harvested by slaves. As abolitionists became increasingly vocal about the immorality of slavery and demanded the U.S. government legislate the abolition of slavery, Southern growers defended the system. Knowing that their livelihoods and the South's economy depended on it. In 1858, Senator James Henry Hammond, 1807–1864, of South Carolina taunted Northern sympathizers, saying, "You dare not make war on cotton, no power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." Hammond was not the first to use the phrase, it was coined 3 years earlier in the title of a book. Cotton's importance to the South contributed to the deepening North-South divide in the nation. By the time the Civil War, 1861–65, began, the southern United States supplied 2/3 of the world's cotton.
What are greenbacks?
Greenbacks are the paper money printed and issued by the U.S. government during the Civil War. The financial demands of the war quickly depleted the nation's supply of specie, gold and silver. In response, the government passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862. Which suspended specie payments and provided for the issue of paper money. Legal tender is money that must be accepted in payment of any debt. Since the bills were supported only by the government's promise to pay, it was somewhat derisively observed that they were backed only by the green ink they were printed with. Hence the name greenbacks. The value of the notes depended on the people's confidence in the U.S. government and its future ability to convert the currency to coin. As the fighting between the Union and the Confederacy raged, Americans' confidence in their government fluctuated. When the Union suffered defeat, the value of the greenbacks dropped one time to as low as 35 cents on the dollar. Greenbacks remained in circulation after the fighting ended, finally regaining their full value in 1878. After the financial crisis in 1873, many people, particularly Western farmers, clamored for the government to issue more. Advocates of the monetary system formed the Greenback Party, which was active in American politics. Between 1876 and 1884, they believed that by putting more greenbacks into circulation, the U.S. government would make it easier for debts to be paid and prices would go up, resulting in prosperity. The country's present-day system of paper money is based on the government's issue of notes, which was made necessary by the Civil War.
When did chain stores begin?
The innovation of the chain store, technically defined as two or more retail outlets operated by the same company and which sell the same kind of merchandise, was made by American businessman George Gilman, c. 1830 to 1901, and George Huntington Hartford, 1833 to 1917. Who in 1859 set up the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company in New York City. Better known as A&P, the stores proliferated rapidly, and other chain stores, such as W.P. Woolworth, established 1879, and J.C. Penney, 1902, opened their doors for business. The early 20th century saw tremendous growth of the chain stores. Between 1910 and 1931, the number of A&P stores grew from 200 to more than 15,000, while the department stores, also a byproduct of the late 1800s, catered to middle and upper-class customers, the chain stores, including Woolworth's Five and Dimes, which sold many items at such low price points, served lower-income consumers. Chain stores, which operate within all major retailing categories, including grocery stores, department stores, and drugstores, as well as apparel and food outlets, offer consumers many advantages. Their system of centralized and mass buying allow them to acquire merchandise from manufacturers and wholesalers at reduced costs. This savings is passed along to the consumer, who pays less for the item. Further, they experience economies of advertising. A single ad placement promotes all the stores within the chain. In the 1920s, independent retailers rallied against the chain stores, citing they had unfair advantages. This argument has resurfaced off and on throughout the 20th century. As chain stores entered into more and more retailing sectors, including hardware, jewelry, furniture, music, and books. But the only federal legislation that constructively attempted to regulate the chain stores came in 1936. The Robinson-Patman Act tried to control competition. Today, chain stores account for roughly one-third of all American retail sales.
What is the Intifada?
Intifada means uprising in Arabic and refers specifically to two recent periods of intense and regular violence between Palestinians and Israelis in the disputed territories of the Middle East. The First Intifada began in 1987 and did not subside until a peace settlement was brokered between the two sides in Oslo, Norway, in 1993. The Second Intifada began in September 2000. The violence of that uprising continued into 2005 despite ceasefire vows from Arab, Palestinian and Israeli leaders. The second wave of violence was marked by almost daily suicide bombings of Israeli targets. including markets, restaurants, buses, and other public places. Israelis view the intifadas as acts of terrorism, claiming the lives of thousands of Israeli citizens. Palestinians in general and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the militant Islamic group Hamas in particular consider the tactics part of their war of national liberation, a decades-long struggle to establish an autonomous Palestinian homeland in Israel. In the waves of violence, casualties were high on both sides. More than 4,000 died in the Second Intifada alone. The cycle of conflict appeared endless. Palestinian acts of violence were met with retaliation from the Israelis, which incited further violence from the Palestinians. Hopes for a lasting peace were raised again in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, 1935, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 1928, held a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They declared a ceasefire agreement and their intentions to resume negotiations, as outlined in the Roadmap for Peace. But the militant Palestinian group Hamas immediately claimed the verbal agreement was non-binding. Indeed, Hamas, which was largely responsible for the Intifada, posed major roadblocks to an end of violence in the region. Before they would put down arms, the group demanded total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Hamas was also dissatisfied with Israel's agreement to release only 900 of the 8,000 Palestinians held prisoner by Israel.
Were activists the only ones who were vocal about opposing segregation?
No, segregation was opposed at every level of black society, as well as by many whites. The voices of the civil rights movement included wage laborers, farmers, educators, athletes, entertainers, soldiers, religious leaders, politicians, and statesmen, all of whom had experienced the oppression of Jim Crow laws and policies in the United States. Before W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, rose to prominence as an educator and writer, he chose to leave the security of his home in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, to attend college at Nashville's Fisk University. There, in 1885, he encountered Tennessee's Jim Crow laws, which strictly divided blacks and whites. He was so intimidated by the Southern system that he rarely left the campus, and he ultimately returned to New England to complete his studies at Harvard University. He did, however, go back to the South, becoming a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University, 1897 to 1910, 1932 to 44. As one of the first exponents of full and equal racial equality. In 1909, Du Bois helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which provided leadership during the civil rights movement. In 1942, a young Georgia man named John Roosevelt Robinson, 1919 to 1972, was drafted into the military. Robinson applied for officers' candidate school at Fort Riley, Kansas. And although he was admitted to the program, he and the other black candidates received no training until pressure from Washington, D.C., forced the local commander to admit blacks to the base's training school. Later Robinson became a second lieutenant and continued to challenge the Jim Crow policies on military bases. When the Army decided to keep him out of a game with the nearby University of Missouri because that school refused to play against a team with black members, Robinson quit the base's football team in protest. At Fort Hood, Texas, Robinson objected to segregation on an Army bus. His protests led to court-martial. Acquitted, in November 1944 Robinson was honorably discharged before the end of World War II. 1939–45 The Army had no desire to keep this black agitator among the ranks. And, as Robinson later put it, he was pretty much fed up with the service. In 1947 Jackie Robinson became the first black baseball player in the major leagues. When he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking the color barrier in the national pastime. In the post-war years, American diplomat Ralph Bunche, 1904–1971, attracted public attention when he rejected an offer from President Harry Truman, 1884–1972, to become an Assistant Secretary of State. Bunche, a Howard University professor who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services during the war, explained that he declined the position because he did not want to subject his family to the Jim Crow laws of Washington, D.C. Bunche spoke out frequently against racism. And in 1944 he co-authored the book An American Dilemma, which examined the plight of American blacks. These are just a few of the many examples of personal protest that signaled the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States.